So the way that I'm going to deal with modifying this curve of the animation is I'm going to change our view. At this point, we've been used to looking at the standard layout view in Cinema 4D. Okay, this is the default view, the default panel layout in Cinema 4D. And many of us might have gotten into the habit of changing into the modeling view when we're actually focusing on modeling. So the panels orient themselves, and the viewport maximizes itself, and extraneous panels are hidden. In the modeling view, the timeline view is hidden. Well, if we click on this and we choose the animation view, something different happens. It actually emphasizes the timeline view, and it gives us an enhanced view of the timeline. And so what we're looking at here is we have a couple of different playheads happening here. We have the playhead that we're used to looking at, which is at the bottom of our screen. That extends to the distance, the entire width of the screen. Okay, and we can scrub the playhead this way, and then we have our timeline view down here. And inside our timeline, we have a little playhead here that we can scrub as well. But the important thing to look at here is this timeline will show us all of the objects that have an animation applied to it. It'll show us everything within our scene that happens to be animated. Now, in a previous experimentation with animation, we talked a little bit about, and you may have discovered, that each object can contain its own animation. The concept behind 3D animation is it's basically object-dependent animation. So if I introduce, in this case, a cube, and I'll just do a really simple animation. So I have the cube selected. My playhead is at the beginning of time, and I'll mark that first keyframe. I'm going to advance the playhead in time, and I'll just move this cube somewhere else, and I'll mark that keyframe. The minute I do that, now I have this cube object that shows up in my timeline. Okay, and this cube is it's showing me the keyframes associated with that cube. So if I look along in line with the cube, I have a keyframe here. This is a keyframe icon, and it's actually telling me that that I have spline interpolation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I have a second keyframe here at frame 50, and if you look above that, there's a summary, an animation summary here, and the summary of the animation is going to show us every keyframe that's in this animation, regardless of what object it's attached to. Okay, so if I look at just the cube object, and I can select that and just kind of focus on those elements, I can see that there's two keyframes here, and there's also the sphere object. Now I can select that cube, and if I'm focused on the timeline and I hit delete, what I've done is I've just deleted the animation associated with that sphere. Okay, so if I want to remove the animation from the equation, I can just select that in the timeline and hit delete. You'll see that my object is still intact up here. I'm going to select my cube in the object manager and hit delete just to get rid of it. And we'll take a closer look at what's happening here in the animation view. So what I really want to focus on here is I want to focus on the animation for the sphere itself. Okay. The thing that I want to focus on is actually the different components which are being animated. And if I take a closer look at the sphere object in the timeline window, there's a little plus sign next to it. And if I click on the plus sign, what that does is it reveals all the parameters that are being animated or being tracked by the keyframe of the sphere. Okay, now don't let this overwhelm you. Don't turn off the computer and run outside. There's a lot of information in here, but we're going to focus on just the stuff that we need to be concerned with. And once we get, like any window in Cinema 4D, once we get used to looking at the window and decipher the information that it's giving to us, there's really some helpful stuff in here, and it allows us to control our animation really effectively. So now, if I'm looking at the sphere, it's telling me that I can look at the position, the scale, and the rotation. Okay, now I don't remember rotating my sphere, and I did not remember scaling my sphere. So these are animation components that are being tracked every time I record a keyframe, but we haven't made any change to it. Okay, the thing that's being changed, if I select my cube here, my sphere, the thing that I've changed is the Y position over time and the X position over time. Okay, so if I look inside the position, I see that I have an X, Y, and Z, I'm still not learning anything about what's going on inside X, Y, and Z until I look at the X position. Let me just, if I look at this position.x, there's a little triangle next to that, and I can reveal that. And what I see, and I'll just try to expand this and make this a little bit bigger. If I roll down to the bottom of this graph or this scale, I can click and I can drag and expand the height of that view. Okay. Now, if I do it on the left side under the summary, I can't do it. But if I do it right here where there's the scale, just above between the bottom of X and the bottom of Y, when this triangle is revealed, we can scale the height of this graph. Okay. Now, what we're looking at here, this is what's called the F curve for the X position of the sphere. Okay, and now again, don't be concerned about what we're looking at here. The key here, I'll decipher this for you, is that we have 4 keyframes in time, right? And they're actually represented here. And this batch of points represents what's going on with the X position, or the left to right position of the sphere over time. If I look at this graph, there's a value that goes from 0, it looks like, to 1200. Okay, and if I advance the playhead to the end, and if I take a look at the final sphere position, and make a note, I'll see that sphere moves from 0 along the X 1200. I'm set to centimeters right now, so this is reading as centimeters. Okay, so that's just what's playing out here. So basically, this thing is moving in essentially a straight path along the X-axis. There's 4 keyframes here over the course of 90 frames. Not very exciting, not very interesting. This is just kind of a straightforward motion through space. Okay. If I look at the Y-axis, and I'll just again grab this and expand that, and I can always just rearrange these windows and really kind of fly in on this graph. Look what's happening here. This is the position of the Y-axis, or the position of the sphere along the Y-axis plotted over time. Okay. Now, it's not too often that we have to look at the F curve, so again, don't be too concerned about this, but every once in a while we're going to need to jump in and we're going to need to control this. Now, that sphere is starting roughly, according to my graph, it's starting in a Y position of somewhere north of 900, okay? And as I advance through time, that position is changing. It's going down towards 0, so it's moving towards 0, which is the origin of our space. It's moving towards 0, where we suggest that it impacts the ground, and then it moves back up, okay? But that curve here, this curve looks more like a roller coaster curve, okay? Now, if we go look at our sketch, I'll go look at DeviantArt. If I were to sketch out that curve, if I want to work more like a roller coaster, let's see if I can change my color here. This animation path is doing this sort of thing, okay? Oops, let me undo that, try that again. Okay, that's the animation path that we have. We have this sort of roller coaster animation path. I want something that's more like the bouncing ball. Well, there's a direct correspondence between, we just actually drew the Y path, or the F curve, the YF curve of our animation when we sketched this out. Okay, so I'm going to undo my red path. I'm going to focus on my blue path here, and I'll actually just emphasize it here with some red ink. Okay, that's what we want our YF curve to look like. So I'll jump back into Cinema 4D. If I select one of these keyframes, you'll see that I have these little tangent points here. Just like using the Bezier, the pen tool inside Illustrator or inside Photoshop or InDesign, you name it, lots of stuff use these kinds of curve handles. I can break these tangent points. If I just take one of these handles and click and drag, I'm basically changing, look how I changed the path, okay? Not exactly how I wanted to change it, so I'm going to Command Z to undo. If I hold down the Shift key while I click and drag one of these ends, I can actually break that tangent, okay? If you notice over here, when I select this keyframe, there's the ability to modify the keyframe attributes over here, and there's this thing called auto tangent, and we can turn that off, and then we can break tangents. But we'll do that with a slightly more intuitive way, and I'll explain all of this stuff in the keyframe attributes over the course of this semester. What I'm doing is I'm selecting a keyframe, the second keyframe in this equation, and while I'm doing this, I'm really focusing on this F curve of the Y motion here, but also look over here to make sure that my animation path doesn't get too crazy. And I'm just going to try to make it look like the sketch that I made. So I'm holding down Shift to break the tangents, and I'm just kind of adjusting that curve. Okay. Now I'm not so concerned about the proportion of the width of this thing, because that I'll be able to change over time. So that actually changes. Once I break the tangents, I no longer have to hold down Shift, and I can come back over here, select that last keyframe, and just kind of lift that up a bit. And if I look over here now, my animation actually gets a little wonky in here, okay, because I have that funny little curve going on here. But I'll correct that here in just a bit. If I want to go in, I could basically start to control these points and kind of smooth that out. And this will be a little tricky based on the way we have this animation set up, but I'll just try to eyeball that and smooth that out. And by raising that up, I'm actually not breaking these tangents because I want the ability to kind of control that. So I've not broken that. I'm just trying to smooth that out. And I'm watching my animation path over here, and that's actually pretty close to where I want to be. Now, the cool thing about the timeline window is that I can select that keyframe, and because I'm dealing with this whole scale is the position of Y. Okay, now I can just kind of click and slide this thing around, and that'll directly influence that keyframe of the animation. Okay, because I'm actually adjusting how high that keyframe goes up on the Y-axis, and just with a few tweaks, I have that animation path looking more or less the way that I want it to look. So I can continue to get in there and tweak that thing, but that's the basic concept for setting up the bouncing ball animation. Now, if I give this a quick play, I'll hit rewind and I'll hit play. Okay, it's a little sleepy towards the end there. This animation, it's taking 90 frames or 3 seconds, and I think I want this to happen a little bit faster. And I got a couple of different options. I've animated this thing over the course of 90 frames. Okay, now I'm going to jump back out to the standard view. Okay, whew, isn't that a relief? Look at that. All that crazy information went away, and now we're looking at our standard view. Now, I could open up the timeline window without having to look at the animation view, and that can be a pretty handy thing. And if I go to the window pull-down menu, I can find the timeline, and the timeline I can pop that open in a standalone view. And this is actually the way that I prefer to work, unless I need to get to really specific tools that are available in the animation layout. This is typically how I like to deal with the timeline. Now, one of the things that I want to point out when dealing with the timeline is I scale this open, the timeline scales with it. They're the same set of controls in Cinema 4D in the timeline view that you might find in the perspective viewport. So in other words, we have the pan, we have dolly, we don't have rotate because this is a two-dimensional timeline. But if I grab this icon, click, and drag on it, I'm dollying out or I'm zooming out of the animation. Okay, and if I want to zoom back in, I can do that. And there's some other ways to kind of frame the animation. If I look, the sphere is the only thing that's being animated, okay, in this scene. I don't have anything else that's being animated. And if I want to compress this animation, right now this animation is taking place over 90 frames, and I want to make this animation take place over, let's say, 30 frames. It's really easy to do this. If I want to adjust the sphere, all I have to do, and the sphere is the only thing being animated, I could click the sphere. There's a little frame range here that's highlighted at the top of the scene, and if I grab it towards the end here and click and drag back, it'll scale that animation, all the keyframes, and redistribute those keyframes proportionally in time. So in other words, I can condense the amount of time that this animation takes to unfold, let's say to 30 frames, and now that animation is basically playing 3 times faster than it had before. Okay? So there's the basic first bounce of my bouncing ball. We're going to add some more stuff to this but I wanted to introduce you to the F-curves. Don't worry about, don't be too concerned about all that information in the F-curves. I will reinforce this really quickly here in the next presentation, so we'll catch up then.